Alright, so we're going to go through the Exodus final, right? So, just like all the finals that we do, you shouldn't have any issues as long as you go through and look everything up that you need to. So feel free to pause, rewind, fast forward, whatever you want to do. But we're just going to go through these real quick. Go ahead and print this out so you've got it with you. The first one, explain the significance of the Egyptian documents that discuss their problem with the Asiatics. So here I want something that deals with the fact that the Egyptians had already talked about how, particularly during the time of Abraham, how they were getting upset because so many Asiatics, which is what their word for anyone from that promised land region, they called them Asiatics, that they were already getting upset with them, which kind of confirms the Abrahamic time, right? And then, so then the other thing is that also confirms why the Bible says that when the Israelites, Jacob and his family get there, that Joseph is telling them, hey, listen, they don't like shepherds, right? Because they have already had these issues and these run-ins with shepherds trying to migrate in during the time of Abraham, and so Egypt had set up all kinds of laws and regulations to keep these shepherds from migrating in like what Jacob was trying to do. And so it all kind of fits together nicely with the biblical record. Alright, number 2. List 2 major evidences that show that Israel was not in slavery for 400 years. Alright, so there's a few things that we could look at. One of them, as I would say, is what the Bible itself says, right? So Paul makes it clear that the 400 year time period is not something that that the 400 year time period was not something that was from the time of the slavery. Paul says that it was from the time that God spoke the promise to Abraham, right? So kind of Paul's teaching there on it. And then one of the other ones is the fact of how closely related Moses is, right? That Moses was a grandson on one side and a great-grandson on the other side of Levi, and they were only living to be about 100 years, 100 to 120 years old during that time, so it would make it very difficult for there to have been a 400-year period, covering just that time, because Levi already had most of his children when they moved in, because he would have been in his 50s. And so, for then his grandson to come 400 years later, it doesn't fit, right? Okay. Number 3, how does the price of a slave during the biblical record help us to date the events? So basically this means that the price of a slave was a pretty standard price in antiquity, right? And so for maybe several hundred years it was 20 shekels, and then for several hundred years it bumped up to 30 shekels, that kind of thing, and then later it became 50. And so because the biblical record talks about the price that Joseph was sold for, it helps us to date the events, if not specifically, at least to the general time period when 20 pieces of silver was used, that kind of thing. And the biblical imagery there of Jesus and the 30 shekels, so a lot of that all kind of fits together. And so anyways, by being able to know how many shekels it was sold for, you can somewhat narrow it down to at least a time period of, say, 400 or 500 year window when the price of the slave was consistent, right? Okay. So 30 shekels, just in case I was confusing on that, was what Joseph was sold for, right? So 20 shekels would have been the time period from, say, or 20 was Joseph's, excuse me, if I can make it even more confusing. So his Joseph's was 20, and that was the time period from 2000 to 1500 BC, right? And so, and then it had gone to 30 by the time period of about 1500 to 1000, right when the Exodus was taking place under Moses. And so the fact that the Bible records Joseph's as being 20 means that he had to have come from that kind of later time period, which fits with what the Bible is saying, because Joseph, according to the biblical record, should have been coming through Egypt around the 1650s, which they were still doing the 20 shekels for a slave at that point. Okay. All right. Number 4. What is the name of the official Egyptian position that was given to Joseph? Vizier. Vizier. Number 5. How do we know that the yam soup of the Exodus account is referring to the Gulf of Aqaba? Well, one of the reasons that we know that is because of 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 26, when it's talking about Solomon and some of the trade routes that were going on during his time. It uses that Hebrew word yam soup, and there it's clearly referring to the Gulf of Aqaba. Number 6, explain a likely way given in class that the Red Sea could have gotten its name. So basically we're talking about the fact that the Gulf of Aqaba there, a lot of it is bordering on the land of Edom, right? And so the Edomites, right, were the descendants of Esau, and Edom means red, because Esau was born hairy and red, and so all of the people that descended from him were called Edomites. And so, in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba there, is the main body of water in Edom. And so it's entirely possible that it got its name from them, right, the Red Sea. Number 7, list and give a brief comment of each of the 7 pharaohs of the Exodus. Okay. So I'll list these through just a little bit and give you a little bit of a comment. So I'm going to go through them quick, though, so you may have to pause and rewind this a few times. The first one was Amenemhet I. Amenemhet I was the pharaoh who was tried to be assassinated, right? And so he was the pharaoh while Joseph was in prison. Was Amenemhet I. He was the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. The second one was Sostres I, his son. And Sostres I was the pharaoh that exalted Joseph to the number 2 position. Right? And then after Sostres II was Amenemhet II. Or Sostres I, rather, was Amenemhet. So it goes Amenemhet I, Sostres I. Then the third pharaoh was Amenemhet II. Right. And so Amenemhet II, if you want to put something under there, you can just put that under his reign, Egypt really began to blossom, and the Israelites under Amenemhet II's reign became very wealthy, very well-to-do, very well incorporated into society during that time period. In fact, this is probably when they really started falling into idolatry, was right through these time periods. After Amenemhet II, the fourth pharaoh was Sostres II. Now, under Sostres II, this is when Joseph died, right? Was during his reign. And then Sostres II, kind of towards the end of his life, so he was the one that Joseph died in. The Israelites still were not fully in slavery at that point, but he was the one where the memory of Joseph begins to fade, right? And so Joseph died during Sostres II's reign there. And then after Sostres II comes Sostres III, right? So Sostres II probably didn't know Joseph much either, right? But Sostres III was really one of the ones that became an enemy, if you will, of the Israelites. And And so he was the one that we believe enslaved the Israelites, right? So Sostres II still kind of knew Joseph. He died in the beginning of Sostres II's reign. And so the Israelites were still at peace, though, all the way through Sostres II. But Sostres III, who came after Sostres II, was the one who enslaved the Israelites. Okay, he's also the one that tried to have all of the Israelite boys thrown into the Nile. So that was Sostres III. He's the one that tried to kill Moses at a young age. Sostres III's son, right, the sixth pharaoh, was Amenemhet III. Now, Amenemhet III would have been the pharaoh while Moses was in his 40s and he killed the Egyptian, right? And so it was Amenemhet III that wanted to have Moses killed. So it was Sostres III who enslaved the Israelites and tried to have all the Hebrew boys killed, right? And then it was Amenemhet III who Moses had to flee from at the age of 40 when he killed the Egyptian. And then when Amenemhet III died 40 years later, Amenemhet IV took over. And Amenemhet IV was the pharaoh during the plagues. He was the one that drowned in the Red Sea. Okay. Number 8. How is the common translation of Exodus 12:40 misleading? Well, in that translation, it doesn't list the phrase "and the land of Canaan." It just says that the Israelites had spent 400 years in Egypt. But the actual text says in Egypt and sojourning in the land of Canaan. Right? And so when you throw off that "and Canaan" part at the end, it makes it appear that the 400 years was just time in Egypt. But in reality, the text doesn't say that. It says they spent 400 years in Egypt and in Canaan. Right? Meaning that the 400 years includes the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Exodus narratives from Joseph to Moses. Number 9, what relation was Moses to Levi? We talked about that a little bit. He was, you could say, grandson through Jochebed, or, great-grandson on his father's side. Okay. Number 10, approximately how many years off is the traditional Egyptian calendar? 300 years. Right? And then 11, explain how the Egyptian calendar has errors. There's two things that are important to remember here. Number 1, many of the Egyptian dynasties were concurrent, right? So, for instance, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th dynasties all reigned at the same time. And so they didn't have those records as accurate when they first started doing the chronology, and they haven't gone back in and changed many of these now that we know some newer things. But the trouble is, they date most of the Egyptian things based on astronomy, right? And so, based on recorded lunar eclipses and things of that nature. Well, the trouble is, they didn't have a close enough starting date because they weren't factoring in these concurrent dynasties. And so when they went in to find the star formations and the lunar eclipses that matched up with what dates they thought they had, they didn't match them up correctly because they started kind of in the wrong spot. So there's really two things there. One, they didn't match up the solar events correctly, and that is because they didn't have an adequate understanding that some of these dynasties were reigning concurrently. And so just nobody is interested in going back in and revising these things, because there's just no point. It's almost like, when a Christian scientist finds something that disproves evolution, and just none of the evolution scientists have any desire at all to go back in and rewrite their scientific history just because some Christian has disproven it. And same thing with this Egyptian stuff. Just because it's been disproven, there's no initiative on their part to want to go back in and rewrite what they've told us. All right, so number 12, explain the significance of Bar Yosef. That is the Egyptian name for the Joseph Canal, right? Which is extremely significant because it ends in Hierapolis, the city of On, which is where it says Joseph was married to the priest of that city. And it is also ends in Hierapolis there, which is where all of the pyramids were built for these pharaohs, these 7 pharaohs that I just read off to you. Their pyramids are there also at the place where the Joseph Canal empties out. And so it all fits together very nicely. Number 13, what other significant information do we learn from Egyptian records about the preparations that Joseph used to prepare for the 7 years of famine? So that has to do with the fact that with that Joseph Canal, it emptied into Lake Moeris, Moeris. Lake Moeris is the name of what they call it today, the name of the lake that Joseph dug, and then the canal itself that empties into that lake was the Joseph Canal. The reason that it's, what we learn from it rather, is that Joseph made preparations not just for grain, but also for water, right, during the famine. Number 14, when the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty writes his son, saying that he has been the victim of treason, what is the biblical connection? I want you to write something showing that the connection was with the butler and the baker that were thrown into prison, were the likely suspects, right, involved in the treason against Amenhotep I, the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. Number 15, records found from Sostres III's general are descriptions of what? Sostres III's general records his military campaigns to subject all the Asiatics who were in Egypt into slavery, right? So really it's a record of the enslavement of the Israelites. They call them Asiatics, which is all the migrants from the Promised Land, which is, would have been what they would have called Israel. And he says that during his time as general, that's what he was famous for, was that he was the one that put them all into slavery. Number 16, explain the significance of Ezekiel 20, verses 6 through 13. Okay, so the significance there is that God is telling them, trying to warn future Israelites that not to make the same mistakes that the Israelites did who were living in Egypt. And basically the implication is that God is saying he allowed them to fall into slavery as judgment because they had fallen into idolatry during the good years of Joseph. And immediately following Joseph's death, during all the blessing of the time of Joseph when everything was booming, the Israelites had fallen into idolatry. And so God allowed them to go into slavery as a form of judgment on that. And so he was warning future Israelites to, hey, listen, don't do the same thing that they did. Stay away from idolatry. All right. Number 17, why was Aaron's involvement in the idolatry of the golden calf especially hurtful? Because the Bible says that before he built the golden calf, he had an experience on Mount Sinai where he actually saw the Lord along with Moses and the 70 elders, and the Bible describes how they were in God's presence and they saw some kind of an image of the Lord. Obviously it wasn't the Lord face to face in all of his glory, because he tells Moses no one could see that, but they saw some kind of an image of the Lord, right? And it talks about it being like him walking on sapphire and all that kind of stuff. And so it makes it extremely hurtful because Aaron was not ignorant of the Lord's presence. Aaron had just been in the Lord's presence, and then so you see the people had not been. But yet Aaron, the one who actually built the golden calf in response to what the people were asking, had been in the presence of the Lord. Number 18, what does Jewish history tell us about the early years of Moses' life? Now keep in mind, this is not biblical history, this is Jewish history, but they say that Moses was a general during his years in Pharaoh's home before he fled after killing the Egyptian. Number 19, explain in your own words the connection between Job and the book of Exodus. So if you remember, I talked about how Sostres III, the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites, who tried to have all of their babies killed, also did this big curse thing, where he made this monument and inscribed a curse on a few of the other leaders of the nations that were surrounding Egypt as a way of cursing them. And the leader of Moab at the time, the one that he cursed, was Job. Someone named Job. Was it the same one? It's entirely possible. In fact, if you go back in and look at the name of some of Job's friends, they are descendants of Esau, right? Which would push them way past Abraham. We tend to associate Job with the time of Abraham, but some of Job's friends, if they're the same people, if you go back and look at the genealogy, there are people with that same name that are referenced that were descendants of Esau, which would have been Edom, which was right next to Moab. So it makes sense that those were some of Job's friends there, the same area over there. And so Esau, though, obviously was after Abraham, and so if these were descendants of Esau, it would push Job's timeline right to around the same time as Moses. And so this very well, and the Bible says that Job was the leader of Moab, right? And so, anyways, it's entirely possible then that the same Pharaoh who cursed, or who tried to kill all the Egyptian or the Israelite babies and throw them into the river, also put a curse on Job. Did that have anything to do with the calamity that fell on Job? I don't know. But the timing is interesting. That and they got this whole monument where he did this big elaborate curse and then carved it in stone against Job. So who knows? But it is kind of an interesting connection there. All right. Explain the significance. These last two I want you to do on your own. I'll go ahead and read them to you. But explain the significance that God fought the Egyptians, but the Israelites fought the enemies in the Promised Land, right? So we talked about that in the last class, and we also talked about this one. Explain the significance that God told Moses his sign would be when all of the Israelites returned to Mount Sinai to worship the Lord, right? So those last two, you want to go back in and look at the last class and kind of go over that and put those in your own words. All right, so you should have no trouble with this. If you do, send me an email, and we'll do our best to help you.